The sharp slap of Carla Simmons's hand against Isaiah Bennett's sent a cold jolt through the first-class cabin, louder than any announcement, heavier than any turbulence. Dozens of passengers saw it, saw the ticket snatched away, saw the quiet boy forced to stand, saw the shame bloom silently across his face, and yet not a single soul spoke. But when Isaiah silently reached for his phone and sent one message, he unknowingly set off a chain reaction that would bring the entire flight, and an entire system, to its knees. The early morning light seeped lazily through the massive windows of JFK Airport, brushing soft gold across the polished floors and gleaming metal beams. Flight 894 was scheduled for a smooth departure, its first-class cabin already resembling an exclusive lounge in the sky, where tailored suits rustled newspapers and diamond-studded wrists flicked through smartphones without urgency. Everything inside the cabin was curated for comfort, order, belonging, at least for those who looked the part. The calm rhythm of boarding was broken when a figure stepped into the first-class section, a teenage boy, walking alone with a steady, unhurried gait. Isaiah Bennett, 16 years old, wore a simple dark gray hoodie, dark jeans, and spotless white sneakers. A small black backpack was slung casually over one shoulder, and a worn novel, its spine softened by many readings, was gripped loosely in his hand. He didn't fidget. He didn't hesitate. His gaze was calm, his shoulders squared, as if he had learned long ago that hesitation only invited more scrutiny. A pair of black wireless headphones rested around his neck, a silent barrier against a world that too often mistook quiet confidence for threat. He carried with him a first-class boarding pass, fully paid, no upgrades, no favors. Yet as Isaiah moved down the aisle, subtle shifts rippled through the cabin, the flick of a newspaper lowering just a fraction, the sideways glance over a steaming cup of coffee, the faint stiffening of shoulders dressed in high-end linen. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their bodies spoke the language of disbelief, of expectation, that a boy like him didn't belong here. Isaiah had seen it before. In classrooms when his hand stayed raised too long without acknowledgement. On sidewalks when purses were clutched tighter. He didn't react. He just walked to seat 1A, near the window where the first slants of morning light illuminated the runway. He placed his backpack in the overhead compartment, settled into the seat, and opened his novel, determined not to notice, not to feel the temperature of judgment cooling the air around him. He had bought this seat. He had earned this peace. For a few blessed minutes, it seemed the cabin would settle back into its curated stillness. Until she arrived. Carla Simmons, head flight attendant of Flight 894, moved briskly through the cabin, her navy uniform perfectly pressed, her blonde hair tightly coiled into a regulation bun. Her smile, rehearsed and professional, lingered warmly for businessmen and elderly couples, but when her eyes landed on Isaiah, it faltered. For a fraction of a second, her polished exterior cracked, a flash of suspicion flickering in her gaze. Isaiah pretended not to notice, keeping his eyes lowered to the words in his book, but a part of him, the part that had learned to read the room faster than he could read any page, braced for impact. Carla approached, clipboard tucked against her side, a slight clench in her jaw betraying her practiced smile. "Excuse me, young man," she said, voice crisp enough to cut glass, "are you sure you're in the right seat?" The question wasn't curious. It was accusatory. Isaiah looked up, meeting her gaze with steady calm. He reached into the pocket of his hoodie and produced his boarding pass, holding it out respectfully with both hands. Carla didn't accept it graciously. She snatched it, glancing at the name, then the seat number, her brows knitting together. "First class," she read aloud, her voice laced with disbelief. "Yes, ma'am," Isaiah answered, polite but firm. "I'm in seat 1A. Carla's lips pressed into a thin line. She glanced around, noting the curious but silent attention of nearby passengers. She tilted her head, voice lowering but still edged with steel. "Are you traveling alone?" "Yes, ma'am," he said again, still calm, still respectful. The answer seemed to confirm something for her, some unspoken rule in her mind about who belonged and who did not. She handed the ticket back to him with a stiff motion, as if touching it contaminated her hand. Then she smiled, an icy, tight-lipped expression that didn't reach her eyes. "There might have been a mistake," she said, her voice sugary now, laced with condescension. "I'll need you to move back to economy while we verify your seat." Isaiah didn't move. He placed his ticket neatly back into his pocket and said quietly, "My ticket is correct. Seat 1A. Carla's smile thinned further, and with a sudden motion, she reached down to grab the boarding pass again. Isaiah's hand instinctively moved to shield it, and that's when it happened. With a sharp slap, Carla struck his hand away, the sound snapping through the cabin like a gunshot. Several passengers glanced up, startled, but no one spoke. A woman in a designer scarf averted her gaze. A businessman adjusted his watch. A young couple sank lower into their seats. Silence, thick, complicit silence, blanketed the cabin. Carla, breathing slightly harder now, said in a clipped tone, "I'm going to ask you again. Please move to economy until this is sorted out." Isaiah said nothing. His hand stung from the slap, not just from the pain, but from the message it carried: "You are not welcome here." Without a word, he closed his book, tucked it into his backpack, and stood up. Every step he took down the aisle toward the back of the plane was a weight, a heaviness that pressed into the seams of the aircraft itself. No one stood up. No one said anything. The great promise of civility in that luxurious cabin had melted away to reveal its brutal truth. It was reserved only for some. Isaiah reached the last row of the economy section, slid into the cramped seat, and placed his backpack at his feet. His phone sat in his lap. For a moment, he simply stared at it. Then, with precise fingers, he composed a text. "She slapped me. Moved me to the back. Sitting in the last row." The message flew into the air, invisible and silent, just like him. And far away, in a corner office high above the skyline where decisions were made in marble halls, Victor Bennett, CEO of Horizon Aviation Group, received the message. He didn't shout. He didn't call for security. He didn't even frown. He simply picked up his private phone, pressed a single button, and issued a quiet command to his operations team: "Hold Flight 894 immediately. Verify Seat 1A. Full executive review. No explanations." The engine rumble beneath Isaiah's seat shifted subtly. Unseen by the passengers, unseen by Carla Simmons confidently sipping her coffee in the galley, the wheels of power had begun to turn. Flight 894, with its polished first-class service and silent economy-class endurance, was no longer moving forward. It had been quietly, irrevocably grounded. And the storm wasn't coming with shouting, or protests, or loud confrontation. It was coming in silence. In dignity. In a quiet message sent from the back of the plane by a boy who refused to disappear. The air inside the cabin grew tighter, almost imperceptibly, as unseen eyes in the operations center tracked the unfolding chain of events. Passengers still rustled their newspapers, still flipped through their devices, still pretended not to notice the way the flight attendants conferred in low, tense voices. But something was happening. Something bigger than a seat assignment. Something that would turn this ordinary flight into something no one on board would ever forget. Isaiah sat still, hands folded over his book, looking out the tiny window into the growing light. He didn't know exactly how the world outside was already shifting because of one quiet call. But he knew, deep down, that this time, silence wasn't going to protect the ones who had stayed comfortable in it for too long. This time, silence would speak louder than words. Isaiah sat quietly in the cramped last row of the economy section, his book resting unopened on his lap, the hum of the engines blending into a heavy silence that seemed to press down on the plane itself. Around him, passengers who had earlier pretended not to notice now stole glances over the tops of magazines and behind sunglasses, sensing the sudden shift in atmosphere without understanding its cause. Isaiah didn't move, didn't fidget, didn't betray a single emotion beyond the steady, composed rise and fall of his chest. He had learned long ago that in moments like these, stillness was its own form of resistance. In the cockpit, Captain Andrew Lewis adjusted the flight plan, his finger hovering over the confirm button when a priority message flashed onto his screen, its header blinking in urgent red: "Immediate hold." Flight 894, await further instructions. He frowned, puzzled. Flight holds at the gate weren't unusual, but direct intervention from the Horizon Aviation Board? That was rare. He picked up the handset. Flight operations, this is Captain Lewis on 894. Confirm hold? The voice on the other end was tight, clipped. Affirmative, Captain. Maintain position. Further instructions inbound. Captain Lewis exchanged a glance with his first officer, a silent conversation passing between them. Something wasn't right. And it wasn't turbulence. It was something bigger, something unseen, and it had already anchored its invisible weight over the entire aircraft. In the back, Isaiah felt the subtle shift. The slight delay. The faint prickling awareness that the flight was no longer proceeding as planned. Across the tarmac, deep within the glass towers of Horizon Aviation Group headquarters, the CEO's office bustled into controlled chaos. Edward Kane, the polished, sharp-eyed executive who helmed the company's daily operations, read the forwarded message from Victor Bennett's office twice, his jaw tightening slightly with each pass. He didn't need to ask who Isaiah Bennett was. Everyone at the executive level knew Victor's only son. And he didn't need to ask what a Class A hold meant when initiated by the chairman himself. It meant the next actions would determine not just the fate of a single employee, but the public image of the entire airline. Kane's fingers moved swiftly across his tablet as he opened the internal live feed from Flight 894's cabin cameras, bypassing normal protocol. The grainy footage showed a boy, calm and silent, sitting pressed against the window in the very last row. Alone. Overhead, passengers shifted in their seats, sensing the tension without knowing its origin. Kane stabbed the intercom. "Get me Captain Lewis now. And have the lead flight attendant report to the cockpit immediately." On the plane, Captain Lewis's headset crackled. "Captain, directive from HQ, have your head flight attendant report to the cockpit. Immediately." Lewis raised an eyebrow but complied. He paged through the cabin system. "Lead flight attendant Carla Simmons, report to cockpit." Carla Simmons, halfway through organizing beverage service with clinical efficiency, blinked in surprise. Rarely in her 20-year career had she been summoned to the cockpit before takeoff for anything other than a safety briefing. She smoothed her jacket, adjusted her tie, and made her way forward with the self-assurance of someone used to being in control. As she entered the cockpit, Captain Lewis stepped aside, and the small screen beside the control panels lit up. Edward Kane's face appeared, cold and direct, the corporate logo hovering in the corner of the frame. Carla straightened instinctively. "Good morning, Mr. Kane." "Is there an sit down," Kane said, not unkindly, but with the weight of authority that brooked no negotiation. "Carla, Saturday, you're aware that this flight was issued a Class A hold?" Kane asked. Carla nodded, confused. "Sir, if it's about the delay, I can assure you," Kane cut her off. "It's not about the delay. It's about your treatment of passenger Isaiah Bennett." The name landed like a slap sharper than the one she had delivered only minutes earlier. Carla froze. Kane continued, his voice tightening. "Isaiah Bennett is the son of Victor Bennett, our chairman and majority shareholder. He purchased a full first-class ticket. He was legally and rightfully seated in 1A. And you removed him. Publicly. Physically. Without verification. Based solely, it appears, on your judgment of his appearance." Carla opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her throat had gone dry. Kane leaned closer to the camera, his face filling the small screen. "Effective immediately, you are instructed to publicly apologize to Mr. Bennett in front of all passengers. You will personally escort him back to his assigned seat. And you will do so without excuses, without hesitation, and with full acknowledgement of your error." Carla's hands gripped her skirt tightly, her knuckles whitening. "Sir, if I could just explain." "No," Kane said, his voice now colder than steel. "You judged. You acted. Now you correct it. Publicly. Or you will be relieved of duty before this aircraft leaves the ground." Captain Lewis watched silently, his own features impassive but his mind racing. This was no longer about a boarding mistake. This was about the deep fault lines that ran under the polished surface of their industry, fault lines that had just cracked open under them all. Carla stood shakily, her world tilting on its axis. She exited the cockpit, the door closing behind her with a soft click that sounded louder than any slam. Her heels, always so confidently clicking down the aisle, now hesitated. Her breath came faster. Passengers glanced up, sensing the disturbance, the unease in her movements. Carla reached the thin curtain separating economy from first class. She drew it back and stepped into the economy cabin, scanning for him. There, at the very back, sat Isaiah Bennett. His headphones hung loosely around his neck. His novel sat unopened on his lap. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes, steady, piercing, unafraid, locked onto hers the moment she approached. For a split second, Carla's practiced composure almost crumbled. But duty, pride, fear, some combination of all three, propelled her forward. She stopped in front of Isaiah, every eye in the cabin now subtly trained on them, pretending to be absorbed in phones, magazines, drinks, but listening with bated breath. "Mr. Bennett," Carla began, her voice trembling slightly despite herself. Isaiah didn't respond. He simply waited, the silence forcing her to continue. "I want to apologize," she said, louder this time, her words cutting through the cabin's hush like a blade through fabric. "I made a mistake earlier. I judged you incorrectly. You had every right to be in your assigned seat. And I am truly sorry for the way I treated you." A mother a few rows up put down her baby's bottle, frozen mid-movement. A businessman lowered his newspaper. A teenager slid his earbuds out. Silence swallowed them all. Isaiah looked at her, measured, weighing her words. Then, quietly, so quietly that it forced those nearby to strain to hear, he said, "You didn't judge the ticket. You judged me." Carla's face paled. No pre-written apology could shield her from that truth. Slowly, Isaiah rose, slinging his backpack over one shoulder, and walked past her without another word. Carla turned and followed. Every step back toward the front of the plane felt heavier than the last, as if she were walking against a current pulling her deeper into an unseen reckoning. Isaiah reached 1A and sat down, reclaiming the space he had been forced to surrender. He didn't glance at Carla again. He simply opened his book to the dog-eared page and stared at it, though he wasn't reading. Carla stood awkwardly for a moment, unsure what to do, before retreating to the galley where she disappeared behind the service curtain. In her absence, the cabin didn't immediately relax. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, realizing perhaps for the first time that neutrality wasn't innocence. That witnessing without acting wasn't harmless. That every silence had its cost. From his seat by the window, Isaiah turned his gaze outward again. The engines hummed, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom with the standard flight announcements, and the wheels began to move slowly toward the runway. But Flight 894 wasn't the same flight anymore. It wasn't just a trip between cities. It was a journey into something deeper, something harder, something necessary. And it had only just begun. The engines of Flight 894 roared gently to life, and the aircraft began to roll away from the gate, but the cabin no longer buzzed with the easy, polished hum of pre-flight conversation. Instead, a heavy, thoughtful silence filled the air, a silence that had weight, a silence that had memory. Isaiah Bennett sat back in seat 1A, his book resting open on his lap though his eyes weren't reading. Outside his window, the tarmac blurred past, golden light scattering in fragments across the runway, but inside the plane, time seemed to have slowed, stretching between the quiet breaths of passengers who now couldn't look at him without looking at themselves. Carla Simmons had retreated to the galley, invisible behind the service curtain, her authority dissolved into the very air she had once commanded. She stood stiffly with her back to the beverage carts, her hands pressed against the cool metal as if to steady herself, feeling the turbulence of her own making, a turbulence no smooth announcement could calm. Somewhere deep inside her, a dawning awareness began to settle, heavier than the clipped instructions she had once so easily given. Above them, as the aircraft climbed into the open morning sky, a different storm was brewing far faster than the plane's ascent. On the ground, a young woman in seat 7C uploaded a 19-second video captured earlier, the image blurry but clear enough, the slap, the look on Isaiah's face, the collective silence of the first-class passengers. She posted it with a short caption, "This boy was humiliated for sitting in first class. Turns out, he had every right to be there." Within minutes, the video began to ripple outward across social media platforms, first a handful of likes, then a surge, then an unstoppable wave. Hashtags began to climb, hashtag Isaiah Bennett, hashtag Seat 1A, hashtag Silent Strength, spreading from personal timelines to newsrooms to television anchors rushing to get the story before the competition did. In the economy cabin of Flight 894, passengers who once buried themselves behind tablets and headphones now sat a little stiffer, glancing toward the front of the plane where Isaiah sat unmoving, a quiet pillar of dignity that none of them could now ignore. A businessman 2 rows behind him shifted uncomfortably, his earlier indifference now sitting sour in his gut. A young woman who had filmed the incident tapped furiously on her phone, uploading her account to Twitter with trembling fingers. Words like unbelievable and heartbreaking and enough is enough began to fill feeds across the country. In the galley, Carla's service phone buzzed once, sharply. She glanced down and froze. The first message from operations, pending suspension notification, immediate upon landing. Her hands trembled slightly, not just from fear of consequences but from the unshakable truth that had finally pierced the armor she had worn for decades. The realization that perhaps she had not been keeping order, but enforcing exclusion. Captain Lewis, in the cockpit, received another tight communication from headquarters, proceed to destination. Passenger matter under internal review. Media aware. Handle with discretion. He exhaled through his nose, keeping his face neutral, but he knew, just like everyone else on board, that the flight would be remembered for far more than its arrival time. At 30,000 feet, a flight attendant approached Isaiah cautiously, holding out a glass of water without a word. Isaiah accepted it with a slight nod, their hands briefly touching, a silent acknowledgement that for the first time today, someone was seeing him without suspicion, without assumptions. She lingered a moment longer than necessary, as if wanting to say something more, but then moved on. Isaiah set the water down, folded his hands over the closed book, and leaned back into his seat. He didn't need to check his phone to know what was happening. He could feel it, the way you can feel an approaching storm before the first drop falls, the shift in pressure, the way people carried themselves differently, the way no one could quite meet his eyes for too long without looking away, ashamed. In the corporate headquarters of Horizon Aviation Group, an emergency meeting had already been convened. Victor Bennett had made it clear, this wasn't about saving the airline's image. It was about addressing the sickness that had been allowed to live quietly in the background of every polished first-class cabin and VIP lounge. This isn't just a PR issue, Victor said, his voice calm but ringing like a hammer against the polished conference table. This is a cultural failure. And it stops today. Meanwhile, on Flight 894, passengers began to whisper. Softly at first, then with more courage. A young mother leaned across the aisle to an older woman and said, "We should have said something." The older woman nodded, her hands ringing in her lap, a lifetime of polite silence suddenly feeling like a heavy chain. A teenager in the back pulled out his phone and started typing a message to his friends. "You guys, something happened on my flight. You need to see this." Carla Simmons remained behind the curtain, isolated by her own actions, feeling the aircraft not just move through the air but through a tidal shift she could neither direct nor escape. No apology she could draft would erase what had already been filmed, witnessed, and lived. The truth was already airborne, and no turbulence warning would blunt its force. As the plane began its final descent, the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but tinged with something heavier than usual. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing shortly. Thank you for your patience. We ask that you remain seated until the aircraft has come to a complete stop at the gate." The words were standard. The feeling they carried was not. Isaiah remained still, his seatbelt fastened, his eyes staring straight ahead now, not at the window, but at the space. Before him, not in anger, not in triumph, in quiet endurance, in a truth too long denied and now impossible to unsee. When the plane touched down, there was no rush to unbuckle seatbelts. No mad scramble for the overhead bins. The usual chaos of arrival was replaced by a heavy, reflective quiet. A middle-aged man in business attire finally stood and walked a few steps toward Isaiah. He paused, words catching in his throat. Then he simply said, "I'm sorry," and sat back down, his hands shaking slightly. Another woman, younger, in a denim jacket, wiped her eyes and typed furiously into her phone, sending out a message not to her followers but to herself, a pledge: "Next time, I will not stay silent." The aircraft door opened with a mechanical sigh. 3 airline executives in dark suits and crisp ties entered, moving with the solemnity of people who knew they were not here to control the narrative but to acknowledge it. They approached Isaiah, their faces open but tense, and the senior among them spoke first. "Mr. Bennett, on behalf of Horizon Aviation, we offer you our sincerest apologies for what you experienced today. There is no excuse. There will be change." Isaiah looked up at them, his gaze unwavering. He listened without interrupting, without smiling, without giving them the comfort of an easy absolution. Then he spoke, his voice low but firm. "I don't need an apology. I need you to understand. Understand that what happened to me today happens to people every day. The difference is, today you got caught." The words didn't rise to a shout. They didn't need to. They landed like stones in a still pond, sending ripples through the gathered executives, the watching passengers, the silent cabin. The senior executive nodded, a tight gesture of respect. "We hear you," he said. "We will act." Isaiah rose slowly, gathering his backpack. He walked down the aisle with steady steps, every eye following him, not with pity, but with a deep, shifting reverence. At the gate, a crowd of media had gathered, alerted by the viral storm that had broken while the plane was still midair. Flashes popped. Voices called out. But Isaiah didn't stop for the cameras. He didn't wave. He didn't pose. He simply walked past them, his presence speaking louder than any press release could. Behind him, in the distance, passengers from Flight 894 exited the plane slowly, many still wiping their eyes, still processing the transformation they had witnessed but not caused. They had seen what happens when silence is allowed to reign, and they had seen what happens when even one voice, calm and clear, chooses not to accept it. In the airline's crisis room, executives drafted statements, debated reforms, and approved a mandatory company-wide training program on unconscious bias and ethical responsibility. But none of that would move as fast, or as deeply, as the video still climbing toward 1 million views in just a few hours. In homes and offices and classrooms across the country, people watched Isaiah Bennett reclaim his rightful place without shouting, without demanding, without folding under pressure. And they asked themselves what it meant that it had taken so much to see him. Isaiah didn't need to become a symbol. He already was. He was the boy who refused to be erased, the boy who reminded an entire industry and an entire country that dignity doesn't have to scream to be heard. It just has to endure. As he exited into the open air, Isaiah lifted his face slightly to the sun, breathed in the sharp, clean air of a world that, however slowly, was starting to listen, and kept walking, his steps steady, unhurried, undeniable. Every story leaves a mark, but some leave a mirror, forcing us to look not at others, but at ourselves. Isaiah Bennett's journey on Flight 894 was not just about a boy taking back his rightful seat. It was about exposing a truth many would rather keep hidden, that silent complicity allows injustice to thrive far longer than loud hatred ever could. Isaiah didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout, argue, or fight. He simply stood his ground with quiet dignity, forcing an entire plane, and eventually an entire nation, to confront what happens when judgment is made before understanding, and when silence becomes a shelter for wrong. The lesson is painfully clear. Injustice doesn't always wear the face of open cruelty. Sometimes it comes wrapped in procedure, delivered with a smile, justified by rules that are nothing more than unspoken prejudices passed down unchecked. And when we, the witnesses, say nothing, when we turn our heads, lower our eyes, pretend not to see, we become part of the harm. Silence is not neutral. It's a choice. And it carries consequences far beyond the moment. Isaiah's story reminds us that we each have a responsibility, whether in the air or on the ground, whether among strangers or in our own circles. We must not wait for a title, a last name, or a social media storm to validate someone's right to be treated with dignity. We must speak, act, and stand, especially when it's uncomfortable. Because justice delayed by silence is justice denied. To everyone listening today, you are part of this conversation. Whether you have faced moments like Isaiah's, or whether you have stood by silently when someone else did, today is an invitation. An invitation to choose differently. To see differently. To act differently. Change doesn't happen in grand speeches or dramatic protests alone. It starts in quiet moments, in the choices we make when no one is watching, or when everyone is. On behalf of U.S. Daily Story, I want to thank you for spending this time with us. Thank you for opening your heart to stories that challenge, stories that demand reflection, and stories that spark hope. If this story moved you, please consider sharing it, not for the sake of virality, but because somewhere, someone else might need the reminder that their dignity is not a favor to be granted, it is a right to be honored. We invite you to like, share, and subscribe to U.S. Daily Story to continue walking with us through real stories that awaken, inspire, and transform. Together, let's build a world where silence is no longer an excuse, and where justice speaks louder than prejudice, louder than fear, and louder than complacency. Thank you, and until next time, keep seeing, keep speaking, and keep standing.